There is a specific sound that used to announce freedom in mid-20th century America. It is the rhythmic metallic protest of a screen door spring. Then the sharp hollow slam. That was the starting gun. Not for a race, for a childhood, for a day of unsupervised sovereignty. You stepped off the porch and into a world that did not cushion you. No rubber mats, no soft corners, just gravel that bit back, iron bars that rusted like old teeth, asphalt that shimmered in summer heat and branded the backs of your legs with a memory you could still feel decades later. In that world, gravity was the primary teacher. If you climbed the ladder to the slide, you signed the contract. If you hung on to the spinning merry-go-round too long, you learned what centrifugal force meant in your elbows. If you fell, the earth met you, and the earth was never soft. But there was a strange kind of clarity in that hardness, because the pain was simple, it was honest, it did not pretend to be anything else. And in the split second between the fall and the first tear, a small American ritual often appeared. A hand would extend, not always gentle, not always patient. Sometimes it was your father, sometimes it was a coach, sometimes it was an older brother who wanted to get back to the game, and the phrase was short enough to fit inside a breath. Rub dirt on it. To a modern ear, that can sound like negligence, like somebody confusing toughness with care. And to be clear, real pain is real. Some injuries deserve real attention. Some children needed comfort and did not get it. But rubbing dirt on it was not a medical plan. It was a cultural signal. It was a way of saying, you are not helpless. It was a way of turning a moment of harm into a moment of agency. Because the dirt was not the point. The point was that you did something. You reached down. You made contact with the world that hurt you. You stood back up. And the clock did not stop for your scrape. The game continued. Life continued. And you entered it on your own feet. That is the first lesson in a certain kind of American psychology. Not the psychology of perfection, the psychology of recovery. It teaches you that your body is not a museum piece. It is a tool. It teaches you that discomfort is not always a crisis. Sometimes it is simply information. It tells you where the edge is. It teaches you that you can feel a sting and still move forward. And most importantly, it teaches you that you do not need a committee to certify your ability to continue. You do not need a formal process to validate your discomfort. You can acknowledge it, then act. People did not invent that attitude out of thin air. It came from somewhere. It came from parents who had lived through hard arithmetic. Many of them had grown up in the long shadow of the Great Depression. They had seen jobs disappear. They had seen pride turn to panic. They had watched adults whisper at kitchen tables staring at bills like they were written in a foreign language. Then came a war that rearranged the planet. When those men and women came home and built quiet streets with lawns and fences, they were not only building houses, they were building a shelter against chaos. They knew something that a comfortable society tends to forget. Safety can vanish. Order can break. You can do everything right and still get hit. So they did not promise their children a world without pain. They promised something else. They tried to build children who could endure it. Their vocabulary was different. They did not always have the words we use now. They did not talk about emotional regulation. They talked about duty. They talked about endurance. They talked about character. Sometimes that language was limiting. Sometimes it could be cold. But underneath it, there was a kind of love that was focused on competence. A parent who says, "Get up," is not always denying your pain. Sometimes they are giving you a gift. They are saying you can handle more than you think. And when you are small, that belief can become a spine. It becomes the feeling that you can bleed, fail, feel embarrassed, and still wake up tomorrow and try again. In those neighborhoods of the 1950s and early 1960s, childhood was not only supervised by parents, it was shaped by the whole block. It was a distributed network of reputation. You were never truly invisible. Every adult was a potential witness to who you were becoming. If you cut through a neighbor's garden, somebody saw. If you talked to the store clerk like you owned the world, somebody remembered. Consequences were not abstract. They were immediate. They were local. There was no bureaucracy. There was no appeal process. The community held up a mirror and asked you to recognize your own reflection. This did not create constant fear in every child. For many, it created orientation. It created a sense that your choices mattered, that your name mattered, that who you were when no one was looking had to match who you were in the middle of the street. It was not perfect. It could be unfair. It could be suffocating for anyone who did not fit the mold. but it did shape a certain kind of internal compass. It taught responsibility as something you carried, not something that arrived from above. Now, if you are younger, you might hear all of this and think it sounds romantic. You might picture freedom and sunlight and kids riding bikes until the streetlights came on, and that picture is real. But it is not the whole picture. Because the same world that built grit also built silence. Some children learned strength. Some children learned to hide. Some families did not know how to say, "I love you" out loud. Some fathers could fix an engine but could not name a feeling. And some mothers carried the whole emotional weather of the house without ever being asked how heavy it was. So when we talk about that era, honesty matters. The goal is not to worship it. The goal is to learn from it. Because the modern world has its own kind of hardness. It is not always metal slides and gravel. It is constant comparison. It is a phone that never sleeps. It is pressure that follows you into your bedroom. It is the quiet anxiety of being watched without being held. A child today might be physically safer and still feel psychologically exposed. They might fall less on asphalt and still feel the impact of 1,000 invisible hits. So the question is not, which generation had it harder? The question is, what builds a human being who can stand up after the fall? There is a trade in every era. The old trade was this: less comfort, more capability. The new trade often tries to offer more comfort, more inclusion, more tenderness, and those are real goods. They matter. Nobody should want to return to a world that confuses cruelty with strength. But there is another danger on the opposite side. If we remove every friction, we also remove the training. If we protect a child from every loss, we protect them from the lesson that loss can be survived. If we treat every sting as a catastrophe, we teach the nervous system to panic at the first signal of discomfort. And then life arrives, as it always does, with its bills and breakups and disappointments. And the first real fall becomes terrifying because there were no small falls to practice on. This is why that little phrase still echoes. Rub dirt on it, not as a command to suppress pain, as a reminder that agency matters, that recovery is a skill, that resilience is not a personality trait you either have or do not have. It is built, it is rehearsed, it is learned in tiny moments, repeated until it becomes automatic. By the early 1960s, something else was entering the living room. A new sound, electric and raw, a rhythm that made parents tighten their jaws and made teenagers feel like there was a door inside them that had just opened. The old contract of quiet endurance was still there, but you could feel it starting to shift, like a screen door spring stretching under a new kind of pressure. That pressure had a soundtrack now. It was not just Elvis on a television set. It was the feeling that the country itself was changing tempo. The parents who built order after the war had built it like a shelter. Square corners, clear rules, a sense that if you worked hard and stayed decent, the world would make room for you. But their children were hearing something else in the air, a hum that said, "There is more to life than being safe. There is fire, there is speed, there is freedom that does not ask permission. And when you grow up inside a fortress, the first thing you start to do is test the walls." That is the paradox of the baby boomer experience. They were raised in the most stable childhood many Americans had ever seen, and then they became the generation that shook the table, not because they were ungrateful, but because stability creates a new question. When survival is no longer the daily problem, meaning becomes the problem. When you're not worried about bread, you start asking what the bread represents. When the fence is strong, you start asking if it is protection or confinement. Then came a night that still lives inside American memory like a lightning strike. February 1964. 73 million people sat in front of their television sets to watch 4 young men from Liverpool. The Beatles did more than sing. They introduced a new kind of togetherness, not the togetherness of family and neighbourhood, the togetherness of a generation, a crowd that did not need a church or a town hall to gather, just a channel, just a shared frequency. The screaming in that studio was so loud it swallowed the music, and that was the point. It was a declaration. We are here, we are many, we are not just children waiting to inherit your world. We are a force. If you are younger listening now, it might sound strange to call that rebellion. Today, identity is built across millions of screens every hour. But in a living room in 1964, that moment felt like a door opening. It was the feeling that the future had stepped into the room and sat down on the couch. But history did not stay bright for long. The early 60s carried a kind of American optimism, clean and loud and almost naive, and then the country watched that optimism break. Not slowly, in shocks, in ruptures. First, a president in Dallas, then a pastor in Memphis, then another Kennedy in Los Angeles. To a child or teenager watching those images on television, it did something subtle and permanent. It made the adults look mortal. The people who were supposed to have answers suddenly looked small. There is a particular fear a child learns when they realize the grown-ups are not in control. It is not just sadness, it is disorientation. It is the sense that the floor can vanish. And it is in that kind of atmosphere that a new style of parenting begins to form, not overnight, not as a conscious plan, but as a nervous system response. If the outside world is unpredictable, you try to make the inside world softer. If the country feels violent, you try to make the home feel safe. You start to lean toward belonging. You start to protect. You start to buffer the sharp edges. This is where the modern debate gets tangled, because it is not really about trophies. It is about two competing definitions of love. One definition says love prepares you. The other definition says love protects you. Both are real, both can be true. But when a society swings too hard in one direction, it pays a price. The boomer generation grew up with love that often sounded like a challenge. Stand up, try again, do not make excuses. It built calluses, it built capability, it also built silence. It sometimes made people feel alone with their pain. Then those same boomers became parents in the 1980s and 1990s. And many of them looked at their own childhood and remembered two things at once. They remembered freedom, and they remembered loneliness. They remembered the long walk home after a loss with nothing but their thoughts. They remembered the sting of being left out. They remembered the harshness of being ranked in public, and they did something human. They tried to remove the part that hurt. They wanted their children to have the freedom without the loneliness, the belonging without the cruelty. So they moved toward a gentler world. And one symbol of that gentler world was the ribbon, the participation trophy. It was not invented because parents wanted to raise fragile kids. It was invented because parents wanted to be kind. They wanted to tell a child, you belong here even if you are not the best. And there is something beautiful in that instinct. There are children who truly need that message. There are children who fall behind for reasons that have nothing to do with effort. There are children who live with invisible burdens, poverty, chaos, a nervous system that never gets to rest. So it matters to say this out loud. Belonging is not weakness. Empathy is not a mistake. A kinder culture is not a joke. But there is another truth, quieter and harder to say. If you remove the relationship between effort and outcome, you do not protect self-esteem. You confuse it. Because confidence does not grow from being told you are fine. It grows from proof. It grows from evidence. I tried. I improved. I earned something, even if what I earned is small, even if it is only the respect of my own conscience. This is the difference between reassurance and competence. Reassurance is a warm blanket. Competence is a fire you learn to build, and a child needs both. If a child only gets reassurance, they may feel safe in the moment, but unprepared later. If a child only gets competence without comfort, they may become strong, but isolated. So the real task is balance. That is the word nobody wants, because balance is work. Balance requires judgment. Balance requires time. It requires being present enough to know when a child is being lazy and when a child is overwhelmed. And here is where the modern era adds something new. The hits children take today are not always physical. They are social. They are informational. They are constant. A child can lose a game and also lose a reputation in the same afternoon. A child can make a mistake and have it replayed in a group chat for a week. A child can be compared to thousands of strangers before breakfast. So when older generations say, kids are softer now, younger people here, you do not understand the battlefield. And when younger generations say, you are emotionally shut down, older people here, you are calling me a monster for surviving the only way I knew how. That is the friction, not just between ages, between nervous systems, between two sets of tools. So let us name the trade clearly. The mid-century world trained resilience through exposure, falling, losing, getting back up. The modern world tries to reduce harm through protection, padding, validation, inclusion. Both are responses to real problems. Both solve something, Both can create new problems if taken as the only answer. Because life does not care what decade you grew up in. The landlord does not give you a discount because you tried your best. The employer does not promote you because your feelings are sincere. But also, life does not reward you for being numb. It does not give you a medal for never crying. It does not give you intimacy for being invincible. The world asks for competence and connection. It asks for grit and softness. It asks for the ability to take a hit and the ability to ask for help. And if you only learn one of those skills, you will eventually break in the place you never trained. That is why the nostalgia is so powerful. Not because the past was perfect, because it was coherent. The rules were harsh, but they were clear. You knew what the world expected from you. Today, the rules feel blurry. You're told to compete and to be gentle, to be independent and to be constantly available, to be authentic and to be brand safe, to be brave and to be careful. That is a harder maze, and it creates a special kind of fatigue. So what do we do with all of this? We start with one sentence that does not insult anyone. We do not need to become harder. We need to become stronger. Strength is not cruelty. Strength is capacity. It is the ability to carry weight without losing yourself. And the most compassionate thing we can do for the next generation is not to hand them a trophy or hand them a lecture. It is to teach them how to recover, how to fail without collapsing, how to feel pain without turning it into an identity, how to ask for help without surrendering agency, how to stand up again. Because the world will still slam that screen door. In every era, it does. And the sound will always mean the same thing. The day has begun. You are going to live it. The only question is whether you will live it as a participant or as a spectator waiting to be rescued. The old phrase was blunt. Rub dirt on it. The modern version can be wiser. Acknowledge the pain, learn the lesson, get back in the game, and that is where the conversation stops being about childhood. Because every generation eventually discovers the same unsettling truth. You do not stay on the playground forever. One day you walk off it. You trade the metal slide for a mortgage. You trade the bike for a commute. You trade the scraped knees for disappointments that do not heal with time alone. And whatever philosophy you picked up in childhood becomes the way you carry yourself through the rest of your life. For many boomers, resilience became a kind of native language. They learned early that you show up even when you do not feel like it. You keep going even when you are not applauded. You endure the long middle of things, the part nobody posts about. They became adults in a country that rewarded that kind of endurance. A country building highways and suburbs and schools. A country that believed in progress as something you could hammer into existence. But history did what it always does. It tested the beliefs. It ran the experiment in real time. The bright promise of the 1960s bled into the long, complicated shadows that followed. Vietnam, cities burning, distrust in institutions, oil shocks, stagflation. The sense that the effortless upward escalator could suddenly stop, and still, people had to raise children, pay bills, go to work, fix dinner, mow the lawn. That is the hidden truth behind most generations. They are not defined by their slogans. They are defined by what they did on ordinary Tuesdays. So when a boomer looks at the modern world and seems impatient, it is often not because they enjoy being harsh. It is because they have lived long enough to watch the ground move. They have watched plans fail. They have watched the country change the rules mid-game. They have seen heroes fall and promises shrink. And when you have seen that, you become protective in a different way. You want the people you love to be able to stand when the lights go out. But here is the part that needs to be said with tenderness. Resilience without empathy becomes rigidity. It becomes a locked jaw. It becomes a person who can survive but cannot connect. It becomes a father who can provide but cannot speak his heart. It becomes a mother who can manage a crisis but never asks for help. And the cost of that kind of hardness is not measured in dollars. It is measured in distance. Distance inside a marriage. Distance between parent and child. Distance inside the self. The inability to name what hurts. The inability to sit with a feeling without turning it into either anger or silence. So when younger generations talk about mental health and language and feelings, they are not automatically being fragile. They are often correcting an old imbalance. They are trying to build a vocabulary for what previous generations carried wordlessly. They are trying to give a name to the weight. They are trying to be honest, and that honesty is not weakness. It is a skill. It can save lives. It can build deeper families. It can stop pain from traveling quietly from one generation to the next like a family heirloom nobody asked for. But empathy without resilience becomes something else. It becomes a life lived like glass. It becomes a nervous system trained to interpret discomfort as danger. It becomes a person who needs constant reassurance because they never built internal proof. It becomes a culture where feelings are treated as verdicts, where the moment you feel offended, you believe you have been harmed, where the moment you feel anxious, you believe you are unsafe, and then the world arrives, not as a metaphor, as a real thing, as rent, as layoffs, as illness, as time, and that person feels betrayed, because they were taught to expect a life without sharp edges. So we arrive at a simple conclusion that is not simple to live. The future does not belong to grit alone, and it does not belong to empathy alone. It belongs to the people who can do both. People who can say, "This hurts," and also say, "I will not let it end me." People who can ask for help and still take responsibility. People who can validate a feeling without surrendering their agency to it. That is the synthesis. And it is exactly what the phrase "rub dirt on it" was trying to deliver in a crude way. Not denial, recovery, not cruelty, capacity, not silence forever, a return to the game. If you want to understand what is really being mourned when someone complains about participation trophies, listen carefully. They are not only complaining about plastic, they are mourning a kind of calibration, a world where effort and outcome had a relationship you could feel, a world where disappointment was private, but survivable, a world where you learned early that you are not the center of the universe, and that this can be a relief, because if you are not the center, you do not have to perform perfection. You just have to participate. And participation in the older sense did not mean you got a ribbon. It meant you stayed in the arena. You learned. You adapted. You tried again. Now think about the younger person listening today. A person raised in a world where performance never ends. School follows you home. Social life follows you into your bed. Comparison is constant. Judgment is quantified. A video gets likes or it does not. A post gets shared or it disappears. A career becomes a public narrative. A personality becomes a product. That is not a soft life. That is a relentless life. It is a life with fewer scrapes on the knee and more bruises on the spirit. So the message to younger generations cannot be, toughen up, because the world is already tough. The message has to be, build the kind of strength that the modern world cannot steal from you. The kind that does not depend on applause. The kind that does not collapse when you are unseen. The kind that does not require a trophy to feel real. And the message to older generations cannot be, stop talking about grit because grit matters. The message has to be, teach grit with connection. Do not hand down endurance as loneliness. Do not confuse silence with strength. Teach resilience the way you would teach a child to swim. You do not throw them into the deep end and mock them for struggling. You put your hand under their back. You let them feel the water. You let them kick. You let them go under for a second, then you bring them up. You say, you are safe. And you also say, you can do this. That is the future. And it starts with a new way of hearing the old sound. That screen door, that spring, that slam. You can hear it as nostalgia. Or you can hear it as a question. When the door closes behind you and the day opens in front of you, what kind of person do you become? A person who expects the world to soften? Or a person who knows how to stand on hard ground? Because the ground is still hard. The ground never signed a contract with any generation. The ground does not care if your childhood was rough or protected. It just exists. It is solid. It is indifferent. And that indifference is not an insult, it is reality. The healthiest relationship you can have with reality is not resentment. It is partnership. You do not demand that the world become gentle. You learn how to move through it with skill. You build a life that can take a hit and still love, that can feel pain and still choose meaning, that can lose and still return. So here is a better version of rub dirt on it, one that belongs to the future. It says, honor the pain, do not worship it. Learn from the fall, do not build a shrine to it. Accept help, do not outsource your life, then stand up. Because the sun is going to rise tomorrow morning. It does not care if you feel ready. It does not care if you feel like a winner. It does not care if you feel like a failure. It rises, and in that light you will have the same choice every human being has always had. You can become bitter about the rocks in the road, or you can learn how to walk. The greatest legacy any generation can leave is not a trophy case. It is not a lecture. It is not even wealth. It is a transferable skill, the skill of recovery, the skill of remaining human when life gets hard, the skill of being tender without being fragile and strong without being cruel. If you can carry that, you carry something that cannot be purchased, downloaded, or outsourced. You carry the quiet wisdom of the survivor. Not the survivor who brags, the survivor who builds, the survivor who holds the door for someone else, the survivor who knows the world will hurt you and still chooses to step outside anyway. So take a breath. Feel the ground beneath your feet. It is the same ground that held the pioneers and the workers, the soldiers and the dreamers, the protesters and the builders. It is hard, it is unforgiving, but it is solid, and as long as it is there, you have everything you need to stand up, to brush yourself off, to look forward, and to begin again.